Well, hello, everybody, and thank you once again for listening to the ESG podcast. This afternoon, I'm talking to Josh Cole, who's from Peregrine Communications, whose research called Making a Difference, Marketing a Difference on ESG was absolutely fascinating reading when we were thinking of content to put on our Keeping Current page. That research and access to it will be available on the Keeping Current page after this podcast goes live. But whilst I've got the researcher sitting in front of me, I thought I'd just ask you, Josh, and thank you very much for doing this, what were overall your findings? Because this was the first piece of research you had done specifically on ESG, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Clive. Thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. We very much enjoyed some of your other episodes. It's a pleasure to be on. I think I should really just start by saying that this was obviously our inaugural piece of research. I think it was something that was very much driven by the fact that we felt like there was a lot of marketers like ourselves, a lot of communication strategists like ourselves talking about ESG without any foundation really of, in a lot of cases, data underlining what they were saying. And really, we felt like there was a huge opportunity to try and add something to not just to the world of marketing and ESG, but also to help guide our clients in a more effectual way, using data to help them make some really serious decisions when it comes to their priorities and their sort of marketing strategies over the next year or so.
In terms of the research, just so everybody's aware, it's targeted particularly at asset managers, isn't it? That's the sweet spot in the financial services sector that you're operating in. Yeah. Let's imagine I'm an asset manager. What would you say were the main takeaways, top level from the research?
I think in terms of the key findings, I think I can probably summarize them really briefly. I think the key thing really is that we're seeing from the underlying data a huge increase in the amount of content being created around ESG. That's not going to be a huge surprise to anybody, but actually, for example, when we're looking at tier one media titles, so really serious media titles around the world, there's been a 67% increase in ESG related content just in the last 12 months until we did the research. It's a huge increase there, which is very indicative, I think, of the increasing interest that we also see from our research in the topic. When we're looking at interest, we're looking at things like the increase in the amount of social media engagement on the topic, in the amount of search traffic for ESG-related phrases. Our research showed a 63% increase in searches globally for ESG-related content, and we looked at 70 or more phrases that people would have been searching for. So there's a huge increase in all of those terms. There was also a 36% increase in social media engagement with these topics as well. So you're seeing a lot of, proportionally, as the amount of content's increased, actually that we're seeing even more engagement from their audience with this content as well, which is really obviously very encouraging for those of us who want to see the industry do better on these topics. The final thing I just wanted to say on that point is that there is a challenge there for those of us who are in this marketing communications world in the asset management space, which is that of the 70 or more themes that we looked at, more than a third of those are massively over-indexed by managers when they're talking about these topics. So essentially, people are piling into a lot of the same topics without really adding anything new in terms of insight or sort of wisdom, if you like, to the conversation. So I think that's something we'd like to see change, and hopefully this report is a step in the right direction.
And if I was an asset manager trying to gain attention for the strategy that I'm adopting on behalf of my client, I'm very surprised that social media should be quite so important. Clearly, historically, asset managers have been a slightly, let's describe it as a genteel, if not also cutthroat industry, populated by a certain type of person. Are you suggesting through this research that actually the internet is democratized asset management to an extent? Is that one of the themes that the research perhaps could be used to draw on?
I think there's two ways of, you certainly can take that view. I think there's two things to say here. I think the first is that there's a whole host of evidence, including our own, but also from other research institutions like Greenwich Associates, that shows that institutional and also retail audiences are really genuinely engaging with investment themes through platforms like LinkedIn, for example. It's almost part of the sort of first initial DD that anybody might do. I think on the other side of things, I think there's there's also the fact that there's internal pressure on asset managers, because there's, one of the strategic concerns is, how do we speak to new generations? How do we speak a language that resonates with what is going to be our future audiences? So I think, even internally there's an understanding that there needs to be a consideration of different mediums, and that obviously includes social media.
Now, let's assume for a second, to suspend your disbelief there, Josh, that I'm a board director of an asset manager, and I've heard of this thing called the Twitter. Of all of the social platforms that you were looking at, is there one that comes to the fore? I'm going to suggest that it's probably LinkedIn, but is that just because of my own personal prejudice, or is that actually borne out by the data?
I would say for the moment it's still going to be LinkedIn. So that's your hunch is entirely correct. I think there's a few things that we love about LinkedIn. Firstly, it's obviously the B2B platform essentially. We also love the fact that if you're going to use it as your own publishing platform, you can be super targeted with the people you're going after. In terms of their job title, seniority, region, that sort of thing, sector, etc. However, what I would also say is, and this is probably going to surprise you a little bit, we're also starting to see Instagram become a really critical platform. Also for not just for sharing images, but also for sharing content and promoting it. No, that's going to sound a bit weird, but actually, I'm starting to see really serious brands like Bloomberg and Goldman Sachs using Instagram as a platform to actually promote content to their audiences. One of the reasons for this is that it has quite a premium feel. It's very millennial friendly, but also its targeting is extremely sophisticated. So you can go after people based on their interests, their patterns of behavior, this sort of thing, and you can actually build that quite sophisticated audience targeting as well. So there's a lot to be said for Instagram as a content promotion platform.
Well, the eagle-eyed listener will have noticed that the ESG Foundation has got an Instagram account, and also it's on Twitter and it's on LinkedIn. But it occurred to me that I can see why you'd segment the potential target audiences by different social media platform. I was having a conversation recently with somebody about Twitter, the fact that perhaps we're suffering from so much overload of information. Has the way that, let's be specific about Twitter, has the way that it aggregates all people, all knowledge, is it exhausting people? I can understand an argument for Instagram appealing to, say, 20 or 30-year-olds. I can understand an argument for LinkedIn, finding people who would have otherwise worn suits to work. Does Twitter actually have a role, do you think? Where do asset managers go next to try to find a new audience?
I think you've touched on something that is important there. I think your assertion is basically correct, that actually Twitter is really struggling with its raison d'etre. I think where it is useful is kind of where it sits in the sort of architecture of the way that information flows around the internet. If you're a journalist, you are not going to be waking up and trawling through LinkedIn to see what content is going to grab your attention or what stories are going to be of interest to you and your readers. You are much more likely to be on Twitter looking for juicy news stories or things you need to get on top of. I think as a medium, it's much more effective in terms of that sort of flow of narrative and stories, if that makes sense.
So let's cut to the chase. Who's doing this best, and who do you think's got still a lot to learn?
I mean, it's actually much easier to talk about which firms are doing it best, because there are some really standout performers in the space.
Name names, they'll be pleased.
Robeco is an obvious standout performer. I've referenced them a number of times in the past. I think not only do they walk the walk, they also do a very good job of talking the talk. So there's some things I love about the way that they communicate their ESG credentials. I think one thing that's brilliant is that they almost offer forward guidance to the market. So they had like an FT profile earlier in the year, which was basically setting out its stall and saying these are the 5 topics that we're going to own this year in terms of the ESG conversation. These are going to be our 5 core themes. So you've got things like biodiversity or deforestation, and actually what that means is they can be really, really focused, and they can say we're going to own these topics. Whereas a lot of other peers would tend to be more scattergun, and it would be more about sort of new ESG hires or sort of perhaps their way of integrating ESG into their approach, which is useful, but it's less interesting than setting out your stall and owning a few topics. Schroders is really, really good as well, for not dissimilar reasons. It's obviously a very different sort of company, but they and our analysis shows this for anybody who wants to look at our report. They can see some more detailed information on this. But yeah, Schroders is a very sophisticated player across the board anyway.
Anybody particularly, Schroders, of course, UK, anybody particular, most of our listeners are actually based in the UK. In terms of the trends then that come out of your report, is there anything else that we might look at in terms of things to learn for the next 6 months? I mean, for instance, are you going to do the report again, or was it a one-off, do you think?
I think we probably will do the research again next year as well. I think the response has been very encouraging, so that'll certainly make it much more likely that we do it again, and also our clients are finding it useful. So.
And in terms of quantum, how many asset managers actually do you cover, or how many are involved? Just so I've got some idea of the quantity of research that you're doing.
So in terms of the research we did, we were primarily looking at the themes themselves rather than managers. Right. We did look at about 16 managers in more detail to see who was sort of owning the space in terms of share of voice and things like that. But we were mainly our concern was to do some research that was going to shed light on which topics managers should be spending more time talking about.
Yeah. I think it's well worth looking at your research, if only because every time I see an asset manager saying, or even an in-house team saying they've just recruited an ESG specialist, my heart sinks, because they've got the opportunity to actually say so much more other than that they've recruited Mrs. Smith. The research that you've got is fascinating, and it will appear after this, as I say, on the Keeping Current page. So for anybody that's listening to the podcast that wants to actually look through it, I would commend Josh's research to you. I think we'll leave it there, Josh, if that's okay. Maybe we can pick up what's happened in the next 6 months in the new year. I think you'll certainly find that there's, you said there was a 67% related increase in content on ESG related matters. I think it'll probably be nearer 200% by the time we get to February, March. Yeah, and good. That's a good thing, isn't it? But I think I'll leave it there and just say thank you very much for spending time this afternoon just explaining what the research was about. It will be available on our website or a link to back to Peregrine Communications. If anyone's enjoyed listening to this podcast, please let them know, and also direct them to our LinkedIn account, also Twitter and Instagram if that's their bag. But for the time being, at least, Josh, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Clive. Thanks a lot.